What I discovered in the film, which is what's so great about documentaries, is another angle which turned out to be the one that was able to get me through the process. And that is, I was insinuated into the world of the deaf when we started to get to know and to interview a number of these survivors. And that was fascinating because to me, they end up, the story in itself, as horrible as it is, ends up being inspiring because these guys who have no voices somehow manage to have their voices heard through their determination and their absolute, almost blind faith that they can do something to protect other children. Really staggering. And as a filmmaker, it was also an intriguing opportunity for me too, because then I was able, we thought about how can we get into that world and show it to those of us who are speaking, who are hearing. And that was really interesting to do. We did a lot of tests and ended up with a rather complicated setup for these interviews with these deaf men, where we had 4 cameras from different angles. And on the A camera was a teleprompter setup, which was rigged to a separate room where I sat with a simultaneous deaf interpreter. And we wanted to do that for 2 reasons. One, so we could have a free-flowing conversation rather than waiting for the translations to happen. But 2, it was very important because then I could actually mic the deaf men. And they first looked at me like I was crazy. Like, what are you doing? We're deaf. What do you care so much about the mics for? And we were miking them, of course, twice, like with a lavalier and then the boom. But it's terribly important because both in terms of the expressiveness of what they do, and also you can feel as a hearing person far more viscerally the struggle to get the words out, because with the grunts, and sometimes some of them did speak when they were younger and they can say certain words softly, or they make sound effects like pa. And that was terribly, terribly important. And so, and it turns out that visually there's a whole nother world there, because once you focus in on them, and we've all seen, who's the woman who interpreted for
our new star, yes.
Yes. So, we've seen them, and they're impressive, but you don't really focus on it because you're not because we can hear, so you're not focused on the gestures, and it's a magnificent and very expressive language, and to see both the innocence and rage on their faces was really something.
I felt like I was going back in time watching them, because you could see the little kid under, behind the middle-aged, or in some cases late middle-aged men, and also the pops and the peas and when they would strike themselves oftentimes. And I guess now that I think about it, there was almost a sort of Catholic prayer quality about some of the signing,
There was. There were this thing, and also as the signers would do this, the priests blessing themselves, there's that very visual aspect. I remember that, I grew up in a mostly Irish Catholic neighborhood where every kid would cross themselves before going up to bat in Little League. And, it is very visual that way. And also, it was one interesting thing. It was a kind of a lucky thing for us. We were in Rome, and we saw a confessional in a church in the part of Rome where we were staying, which had these kind of frosted windows on the doors. And so you could actually see the silhouette of the person inside. You couldn't see them really and who they were, and you couldn't hear them, but you could see them inside. And then we did some modest sort of recreations, or whatever you want to call them. I hate that word, but and we reconstructed that so that you could see the signing from outside. So because that's how, of course, in confession, in the deaf would have to do it. They'd sign to each other, and the opening, which is normally a kind of, usually it was a kind of a pegboard, so you could hear but you couldn't see. In this case, the pegboard was removed and they signed with each other, but in this way you could kind of see the dancing signs from outside the confessional.
The way you just put it, when you think about, especially back then, we're talking the 50s, 60s, 70s, that enormous chasm that people have to leap when they've been sexually abused. That think of how much greater, wider, deeper that chasm is if you can't hear. I mean, the kind of courage, I can't even imagine the kind of courage it would have taken to make that leap.
Well, it was even worse in this sense because as a good criminal, Father Murphy plotted his crimes very carefully, and he used the confessional to seek out victims by learning testimony about some of these characters and kids. And what he would do was he would prey particularly on kids whose parents did not know how to sign, so that they could not, in fact, talk to their parents about it without an intermediary, often Father Murphy. And that was maybe the most terrifying thing of all. But it was interesting you raised the whole sort of counterculture thing, because in fact what happened was after the 3 or 4 of these kids got out of school, all of whom had been abused by Father Murphy, they then had gone to college, and they somehow managed to get together in the Milwaukee area together, and they all started hanging out. And they started smoking dope together, and they're talking. And as they were talking, they started to reminisce and talk to each other about what had happened at St. John's. And then they became increasingly angry and increasingly upset until finally they sort of goaded each other to do something about it. And initially, it's a really remarkable story, because initially they said, okay, screw it, nobody's going to listen to us. So what they did is they printed flyers and pamphleted this, both the school and outside the massive cathedral in Milwaukee. Lawrence Murphy abuses children, this kind of thing. And one of their hearing advisors, who worked with one of them at a local metal shop, said, don't do that, it's not necessary. If we bring this to the attention of the Archbishop, he'll put a stop to this immediately. Well, they went to see the Archbishop. 2 representatives of the Vatican were there, and much to their surprise and shock and horror, the Archbishop was furious at them for doing this to Father Murphy, because he had raised so much money for the school and he was doing so much good for deaf children. What were they trying to do to rain on his parade? So imagine the shock of these guys. Finally, they're being told that, if they go through proper channels and proper authorities, everything's going to work out, and the proper authority looks at them and says, you got to be kidding. There's no way we're going to punish this man for doing what he did.
A novelist, a filmmaker would, in writing about people who have done, I don't know that I believe in the word in evil, in the concept of evil, but let's use it here, have done evil things. The novelist or artist tries to put him or herself into the head of that evil person. You're a documentary filmmaker. Do you, in making a film about this man, these men making a film about people who've tortured other people to death in Taxi to the Dark Side, does it help you as a documentary filmmaker to try to go to that place, to try to go to figure out what they were seeing when they did this? Or do you find it actually better to keep a kind of an analytical distance from it?
I actually find it useful to do a little bit of both. I think particularly early on, it's a good thing for a nonfiction filmmaker to assume more of a novelist's position. That is to say, your job is to understand what it is that the person is trying to tell you, to try to understand the characters from the inside out. It's later on when you have to achieve a kind of a distance. And I'll give you an example. In Taxi to the Dark Side, I interviewed a number of prison guards who literally beat a man to death in a Bagram prison in Afghanistan. They literally beat him to death, and it was ruled a homicide by the Army. I started to interview these guys, and I found myself becoming increasingly sympathetic. I won't even say guys, they struck me as kids. Some of them were really big, but they were really young. And it was clear that they were unprepared, they didn't know what they were doing, they had no training, and they were caught up in this war, and things got out of hand. And we did a cut of the film, and we realized that the presentation that we made of them was so sympathetic as to convey the idea that they had no responsibility for what they had done. So we actually went back in and methodically put back certain bits and pieces of evidence that showed just how brutal they had been, in order to be able to remind viewers of the brutality of their actions because, we had gone too far in the other direction. But the fact is that, with the possible exception of Dick Cheney, I don't really think of people as wearing white hats and black hats. I think that
I'm very glad you made that exception.
I think that you can talk to any number of people, and I used to think it's ironic that a really nice guy could do really evil things. I don't think that anymore at all. I think it's almost always part of the package. You see this sort of rash of pedophilia now, not only in the church, but Penn State, you see it at BBC, and what you find is that very often the criminals in this instance are not sort of the people who are skulking in the corner like, Bram Stoker's Dracula. They're actually hiding in plain sight. They're the most charismatic, the most charming, the most outgoing characters possibly imaginable, which of course is perfect because then it gives them more access to victims and it gives them a better, they can skate on it because very often I think all of us are prone to thinking of people as either good or bad. And I remember my producers on Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, for example, really felt that the film would be more commercial if I made more merciless fun of Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling and didn't include any information about their humanity. And I remember really ruddering very strongly against that. I was not a fan of theirs. I was appalled by what they had done. But seeing it from the inside out, I realized that they had managed to deceive themselves, that they were actually doing good for the world. And this fraud that they somehow had concocted in their minds was actually possibly good for everybody. That's how people sleep at night. That's how it works. And that's why in Mea Maxima Culpa, we actually name the phenomenon, which very often police units talk about, called noble cause corruption. Once you believe you're good, you think you can do no wrong. And that's the most dangerous part. That's how institutions corrupt themselves. And the Catholic Church is particularly susceptible to that because it's an institution dedicated to charity and love. Who could possibly abuse children in an institution like that?